Kingsfield 4 is just way too slow. It's unreasonable to expect a player to endure an exploration-based game where you move at a snail's pace. So when FromSoft made Shadow Tower Abyss just 2 years later, they approached it with a specific goal. Make Kingsfield 4 again, but this time make it playable. What's most remarkable is that the West received a port of Kingsfield 4, but not Shadow Tower Abyss. Sony stepped in and determined that Shadow Tower wouldn't sell, so the localization was cancelled. Classic Sony blunder. Why they didn't step in for Kingsfield 4 instead is beyond me. But I wasn't joking when I said Shadow Tower Abyss is basically an attempt to make Kingsfield 4 playable. I'd hesitate to call it a great game, but it's pretty good. You're on an expedition and jump down a dark pit just because, and then the game starts, and 2 seconds later you're killed by some cheap trap. FromSoft's game design during this era was bizarre. They gave warning signs for traps that only work in retrospect. In Kingsfield 4, when you start the game, you can see lava on your left, but how would a brand new player expect the ground to collapse moments after starting? They haven't been taught how this world works yet, and the game never utilizes a trap like that throughout the rest of the game, so it's not like it's teaching you to look out for traps. It's just done as a cheap death. Shadow Tower Abyss plays a similar trick. Seconds after starting, you hear a sound, and then a statue falls and kills you. So now that this is a trend, I get that it's a joke the devs threw in there. There really aren't any cheap deaths like this throughout the rest of the game. There's no tutorial, Kingsfield 4 didn't have one either, and it's for the best. Really don't need tutorials in games. But it's got the same controls as Kingsfield 4. Tank controls on the D-pad, the triggers control the Y-axis. I should hate that these controls made a comeback, but there's a reason for them being this way. Combat involves using the right stick to attack. Depending on the direction you move the stick, your attack will change. You can stab, slash left and right, swing downwards, and this is relevant because you can dismember enemies. If you chop off their limbs, their behavior will change. Cut off the arms and they'll change the way they attack. Get rid of their eyes and they'll have a hard time finding you. It's so satisfying to hack enemies apart, not just as a visual treat, but because you can target limbs as a form of crowd control. And if you're fighting against a wall, instead of having a single attack animation that could potentially hit the wall and bounce off it, you can change the direction you swing your weapon to attack from a better angle. If an enemy is too far away from you, you can stab to close the distance, which fixes that depth perception problem from Kingsfield 4. Once again, you've got a stamina system, but it's incorporated much better. Instead of waiting for a meter to fill to determine how much damage you deal, you've got these little nodes. Each one represents the number of times you can attack, and because your attacks come out so fast in this game, you can chain attacks up to the number of nodes you have available. I can't even begin to describe how much better this plays than Kingsfield. Even though your base movement speed is still somewhat slow, combat flows much faster, and enemies are more engaging to fight. The camera controls aren't ideal, but at least it makes sense for the layout to be this way. The right stick has a use this time around. There's also a durability system for gear. Kingsfield 4 had equipment durability. That didn't really matter. Gear never breaks because you're finding new weapons and armor every 5 minutes, and these durability thresholds are just way too big. But the stat benefits degrade as the durability worsens. You could wait in real time to repair your gear at one specific NPC you find halfway through the game, but you never need to. I ignored the entire mechanic without any issue. In Shadow Tower, the durability levels have been massively nerfed to the point where most melee weapons near their breaking point after just a few minutes of use. There are 2 reasons why this change is great. Number 1, you're still picking up new gear like crazy, and you're incentivized to use most of it because of how brittle everything is. Can't really get too attached to a sword because before long it'll start to break, so hoarding weapons actually makes sense this time around. And number 2, vendors are much more common than the ones in Kingsfield 4, and selling gear is your primary method of making money. So the strategy is to use everything until they're near their breaking points, then trade them in at the shops and use that money to buy the latest and greatest gear. You can also sacrifice your gear at these red statues to replenish your health, so equipment is your best form of currency in this game. But there's a cost to carrying all this gear. You can only carry a certain amount of weight, and even though there's a ton of loot to grab, you can't haul it around everywhere. Carrying 20 swords to skirt around the durability mechanic sounds like a good idea until you realize that you're forfeiting your ability to pick up all the new crap you'll find. because when you pass that weight threshold, you move very slow. Thankfully, you can stash your gear at certain statues or just sell it for money. You'll find more gear than you know what to do with. This game really isn't that difficult. And the reason it's not that hard is because now you've got a gun. And the gun is the be-all, end-all solution to anything that's given you a hard time. Even without the gun, the game isn't that challenging because healing items heal you to full instantly, and learning enemy patterns isn't that tough anyway. But I'm not sure why the guns weren't balanced. They tried. You can't reload them at will, they only reload once you empty the magazine. When your gun is drawn, you move at Kingsfield speed. You can't holster the gun unless you play with a certain layout, which makes no sense. And there's no aiming reticule to aid you, so there was an attempt to incorporate drawbacks, but none of this matters because enemies weren't designed with long distance combat in mind. Most of them stagger when they're shot, so you can just stay at a range and snipe them to death. There's ammo to consider, but you can buy the rounds from shops and you'll find plenty from exploring. To give you an idea of just how bad this is, here's a late game boss. And here's the final boss. The guns are so broken that you can completely ignore the magic system. You have to equip rings to cast spells, and of course these rings can break like any other piece of gear. They have their own dedicated stamina notches, but why bother worrying about ring durability and replenishing your MP bar and wearing equipment that boosts your various magic stats when you can just use a gun and it chews through everything and it's much faster. But even though guns are broken, it's still fun to blast apart enemy limbs from a distance. The gore goes a long way towards making combat satisfying. I just wish you didn't need to switch to a dedicated control scheme if you plan on using guns. Using the default layout, you need to click the right stick to fire, and you can't holster two-handed guns. You need to unequip from the menu if you want to continue walking around at a normal speed. The gun layout fixes these issues, but it's not suited for melee combat. You miss out on being able to aim attacks with the right stick. Couldn't I just press triangle to holster my gun instead? Triangle switches between your gun and your melee weapon, but if you're using a two-handed gun, triangle does nothing. Why can't it holster the gun? Progression works similarly to Kingsfield 4. You keep returning to this central tower, except instead of heading down the entire game, you're going up. And you've got to take these detours off to the side to explore areas, fight bosses, and grab keys. The game is more linear than Kingsfield, but there's still a nice sense of exploration. You open up shortcuts and find hidden walls, you just don't waste a whole lot of time backtracking. Almost everything that was an issue in Kingsfield has been addressed. Status effects last around a minute if you try to wait them out instead of 20 years. I call this status effect a Kingsfield status. When you pick up items, the game still wants to show them off every single time, but you can mash through the animation now. Selling items from your inventory is much faster because the game memorizes your position this time. Maps are more frequent because you find them on the walls just by exploring, and they mark where you are and where the points of interest are, even though sometimes I'm not really sure what the hell I'm looking at. The environmental storytelling in general is much better. There are enemies that don't want to attack you, some will even speak or run away. You can see decayed bodies here, and when you enter the next area, you'll become poisoned. So this decayed body was a warning sign. He died from the poison long before the water was purified in this room. The bloody writing on the wall even says as much. There's a side quest where if you give this guy some money, he'll hand you a key. He says the room it opens has treasure that'll help you out, but when you go inside, you'll see that all the chests are looted except for one, which is rigged to explode when you open it, and all his friends are dead, leaving bloody messages warning you about this guy. So when you leave the room to try to kill this guy, he's already gone. You find him later on and he baits you into crossing a bridge. I wasn't falling for that, so I shot his ass and his body collapsed on the lever, dropping the bridge anyway. There are even bloody trails that lead to dead ends, which clue you in on where the invisible walls are. It's a much easier game to digest visually when compared to Kingsfield 4. Kingsfield had messages that adventurers left on the walls, but it was difficult to notice them because they blended in. In Shadow Tower, the bright red helps the messages stand out. But there's a little bit of a misstep here. There's no music. The title screen has this strange jungle beat, and that's it. I know the first Shadow Tower didn't have music either, but it's such a strange choice to neglect having any music. The game isn't scarier or more moody by leaving out the music, it just feels like something is missing the entire time. Leveling up was also handled in a strange way. You don't level up. You gain stats as you kill enemies, but the stat gains are so minor that they're imperceptible until you've killed more than a few enemies. You can find items that allow you to allocate stat points, but this doesn't really seem to make much of a difference, at least as far as I can tell. Most of your stats are going to come from your gear. One of the stats seems to affect the number of stamina nodes you have, but I wasn't able to tell until towards the end of the game. I'm not sure why this information can't be referenced in-game, but at least it's easy enough to play that you don't need to waste your time focusing on specific stats. It's also pretty short. I beat it in around 10 hours, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a good thing because short games are much easier to replay than long ones. But the game feels a bit rushed. There aren't many bosses and none of them were balanced around ranged combat, so fighting them feels uneventful. The first half of the game has these interesting NPC questlines, but the back half doesn't, or at least none that I found. Some of these areas feel like they're optional, like this waterfall zone. I scoured this entire area twice looking for a progression item that didn't exist. This moving platform area towards the end of the game is packed with loot. So much gear that you'll never use because the game ends 20 minutes later. It feels like the developer spent all this time creating these weapons and armor, ran out of places to stash them, and just dumped everything in this one level. Some areas feel well thought out and others don't. This hive at the start has you collecting insect parts to open locked doors, and the entire area is designed around backtracking to open up new paths. It's structured pretty well, and finding the next key item gives you a nice sense of progression. This foggy zone towards the end is just miserable. It's filled with these invisible flying enemies that like to snipe you from across the room, so you wind up walking around with your gun out most of the time, scouring for tiny Tetris pieces so you can open the path to the boss. The final dungeon is thematically really cool with these colored windows, but it's just filled with one enemy type that attacks so slowly that it basically doesn't attack, and it reuses the same mini-boss over and over, just recolored each time. It feels like a game that was either rushed or didn't have much of a budget. They certainly didn't take the time to balance the game. You'll find hundreds of weapons, but even with a durability system, you won't come close to using most of them. You can sacrifice your health to repair equipment, but there's no point. I never used this mechanic. There's gear that wards against status effects that you'll rarely see. You see poison in the poison area at the start of the game, but then never again. So why should I care about finding gear that wards against poison hours later? Some weapons inflict debuffs, but enemies die so fast that it doesn't matter. Why should I care that my sword can poison an enemy? Am I supposed to proc poison and then wait for it to die to preserve my durability? I've got like 20 swords in storage that I'm never gonna use. There's New Game Plus that lets you carry over your stats and gear, but the difficulty stays the same. The first playthrough was easy enough as is, so unless you want to feel like God and smite every enemy in one hit while you speedrun the game, I'm not sure what the point is. But overall, Shadow Tower Abyss is pretty good. It doesn't overstay its welcome, melee weapons are fun to use, and the dismemberment is great. I know people aren't a fan of durability in games, that seems to be one of the biggest complaints with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but durability is what encourages you to explore for replacement gear. It feeds into the adventure aspect where you might find yourself low on supplies and forced into using whatever crap you pick up next. Some of the best shrines in Tears of the Kingdom are the ones where you can't use your own weapons, you're forced to use whatever you find inside. And in spite of its flaws, Shadow Tower still feels more enjoyable to play than Kingsfield 4. Kingsfield 4 is just way too slow for its own good. It's less combat focused than Shadow Tower, it's more puzzle oriented, but the puzzles aren't interesting. The enemy design feels lazy, just copy and pasting the same enemy a dozen times in the same room. You move in slow motion, even though it feels less rushed than Shadow Tower Abyss. It's much less fun to play. It's one of those games that people appreciate because of its pedigree, but when you actually sit down and try to play through the game, you'll realize that you'd rather play anything else. This isn't an indictment against the games FromSoft made years later. It's just not that interesting of a game to play in its own right. Play Shadow Tower Abyss instead.